Hello students, today we'll discuss the social science passage in the March 2021 US SAT test. So let's begin. This passage is adapted from Georgia Guglielmi, Small News Outlets Influence Us More Than We Think, by American Association for the Advancement of Science. Assessing the influence of news media is tricky. Researchers can't peer into voting booths or people's living rooms, and news organizations aren't typically willing to have outsiders interfere with their content. That's why it took a team of social scientists 5 years to get 48 US news organizations to agree to run an unusual set of experiments. Instead of simply tracking what the outlets were publishing, and analyzing their impact on public opinion, the researchers took an approach similar to that used in clinical trials to evaluate the effects of new drugs. They manipulated the type of news stories run and then assigned a treatment week when the stories would run and a control week when they wouldn't. This way, they could tell whether those particular stories were having any effect on public discussion. Right, so this first paragraph basically describes the process that these social scientists followed to track the efficacy of the news stories and the influence of these news stories, how they were received by readers or viewers. Okay, uh, let's begin. Most participating outlets were small, with fewer than an estimated 200,000 page views per month, and a few were mid-sized, like the Wisconsin-based magazine The Progressive, which had more than 250,000 page views per month. The nonprofit news organization Truth Out, based in Chicago, Illinois, represented a large outlet with an estimated 2 million page views per month. The researchers, led by Gary King of Harvard University, asked groups of 2 to 5 of these news outlets to write stories on broad policy areas, including race, immigration, and climate. For example, if the broad area was technology policy, the specific story might be what Uber drivers think about self-driving cars. The outlets could choose the policy area, the stories to cover, and the types of articles to write, such as investigative reports or opinion pieces. However, the researchers could reject a story if it was outside a specific policy area. The outlets were free to publish whatever story they wanted outside of the experiment. Okay. Then the researchers flipped a coin to decide during which of the 2 consecutive weeks these clusters of stories, all on the same topic, would run. Finally, they measured the number of tweets about both the specific stories and the broader policy issues during the week when the stories ran compared to the week when they didn't. Right? So this basically tells me that they kind of got news media outlets to write about specific issues, and then they kind of decided on one experimental week when those stories would run and one control week when they would not run. Then they tracked how audience, viewers, readers reacted. Twitter posts on these topics increased by nearly 63% over the week in which the stories were posted. On average, Americans wrote more than 13,000 additional social media posts about a specific policy area on the day the stories ran and in the following 5 days. What's more, the cluster of stories swayed people's opinion by 2.3% in the ideological direction of opinions articles, suggesting that news media might, in some cases, change people's beliefs. So, this is the results, right? This is what was found by the scientists studied. They discovered that this is how one, there was definitely greater discussion during the week when the stories were published, and two, the opinion pieces were also able to some extent, shift uh, the views of the readers or the views of those engaging with these posts in the direction of what the piece was arguing. The team repeated the experiment 35 times and observed that stories boosted posting by men and women alike, as well as by people living in different US regions with different political orientations and influence on Twitter. Removing larger outlets from the analysis didn't change the effect on public conversation much, suggesting that no single large news organization was responsible for the increase. So it wasn't that the big organizations were driving this, because when they removed a large outlet from the analysis, the results were still significant. Okay. However, if the researchers had recruited large mainstream outlets, the spike in discussion might have been bigger. When they looked at stories published by the New York Times on little discussed topics such as how fracking affects the quality of drinking water, they found that Twitter posts about the broader issue of water quality increased by 300% in just one day. Though excited by the study, economist Matthew Densko points out that only about 20% of Americans use Twitter, so the results might not be widely applicable outside social media. But to King, Twitter users are a valuable resource to assess the agenda setting power of media because they represent those people who are willing to speak up to influence policy. Okay, great. And then we have this figure, uh, modeled effect of experimental news stories. Okay, so as the days following the publication of the experimental news stories, number of posts in excess of average fell, right? And then modeled effect of experimental news stories on Twitter posts, percent change in number of posts as compared to average. So there was high influence, okay, as per user influence. So number of posts, so high influence ones still maintain the percentage change is not that high. Okay, so let's look at the main purpose of the passage. Question 11. Option A, summarize an open question with respect to social media and propose a study to examine the question in greater depth. Option B, introduce a common misunderstanding about mainstream media outlets and describe a study that challenges that misunderstanding. Option C, outline a study that compares trends in social media use among different demographic groups and suggest an explanation for the results of that study. And option D, describe a study's novel way of assessing the impact of news media on public opinion and report the findings of that study. Right. So I think D is a good answer in this case because the first obviously is the fact that the study used a novel way. That is something that is supported in the passage because it says that the scientists did an approach which is similar to that used in clinical trials. Right. So this is something which was not tried for news earlier. So this was novel. And also the fact that they were looking to assess the impact of news media on public opinion, right? So D is definitely a good answer. So you go with D for this. But what about A? Summarize an open question and propose a study. So there's more than proposing a study, right? There was actually a study that was conducted, and um, the open question bit is okay. But yeah, I'm not happy with proposing a study. Option B, introduce a common misunderstanding about mainstream media outlets. I'm not happy with the word misunderstanding. It's rather to see the influence that they have on viewers. So B is not a good option. Outline a study that compares trends in social media use among different demographic groups. So that's not correct because that's not the purpose, right? We are not really looking at men versus women, etc. Right? That's not the main purpose. They do include that in their analysis, but the main purpose is not men versus women or high earners versus low earners. So demography is not the main purpose of the study. Okay, as used in line 4, interfere with most nearly means. So let's read that. Uh, News organizations aren't typically willing to have outsiders interfere with their content, which is to say that outsiders change their content or uh, somehow alter their content in some way. So yeah, so the best answer is modify, right? Modify is closest to change. So we'll go with C for this. Okay, what choice best supports the idea that the researchers needed a mechanism to determine whether changes in public opinion were the result of the experimental stories and not some other factor. They needed a mechanism, right? So let's look at the line numbers here: 1 to 4, 5 to 7, 7 to 11, and 12 to 16, right? So 1 to 4 is just describing the why the influence of news media. Assessing that influence is tricky, so it can't be that. Um, that's why it took a team of this describes the time it took, so it doesn't really talk about the mechanism to separate experimental from control. 7 to 11, uh, yeah. So 7 to 11 is describing the experiment about how, instead of simply tracking what the outlets were publishing, which a search took an X, but it doesn't really tell me in what way were they ensuring that the influence was down to the experimental, the experiment, right? So, and 12 to 16, they manipulated the type of stories run and then assigned a treatment week when the stories would run and a control week. This way, they could tell whether those particular stories were having an effect, right? So that is the right answer, because if the if there was a control week when no stories were run and there was a treatment week when they were run, then the difference in the results would indicate that the stories themselves had an influence, right? So D is very clearly the right answer for this. According to the passage, the opinion articles used in the study had what impact on the opinions of Twitter users? Okay, this is not evidence related. So let's go with the options. Twitter's users' opinions change to be increasingly negative towards a specific policy area. Okay, Twitter users' opinions change somewhat towards favoring the article's position on the policy area. Twitter users' opinions showed no measurable change, and Twitter users' opinion changed only in response to areas that already interested them. Okay, so I think the answer for this is B, because if you read, um, yeah, it says here, what's more, the cluster of stories, line 50, swayed people's opinions by 2.3% in the ideological direction of opinion articles, suggesting that news media might in some way. So the the opinions change somewhat towards favoring the article's position. That is what the line is saying. So B is a good answer. So I'll go with B. A is not correct because they were not negative towards any particular area. They swayed in the direction of what the article was recommending. So A is wrong. C is not correct because there was a measurable change of 2.3% in the direction of the article's opinion. And D is not correct because there's no mention of areas that interested those users. There was a general trend in the shift towards the article's opinion. So B is the best answer. As used in line 55, boosted most nearly means. Let's look at line 55. Boosted. The team repeated the experiment 35 times and observed that stories boosted posting by men and women alike. So that is, they kind of increased. Increased is the good word. So let's see if we can find a synonym for that. Advanced, yeah, raised, right? They raised, increased. That's the best in this context, because what advanced is not really the correct word in this context, because to advance is to take something forward, right? For example, to advance the cause of liberation or to advance the cause of civil rights. But here we're talking about an increase in the posts, right? So raised is better. Okay, let's look at 16. It can reasonably be inferred from the passage that the design of King's team's experiment made it less likely that Twitter users would read more stories from participating news media outlets than they usually did. News media outlets would be able to choose which stories to publish outside of treatment weeks. Twitter users would realize that there was something unusual about the media outlets' publication output, and news media outlets would run stories on any particular topic for more than 1 week. Okay, interesting. So let's go back and read. So we are in the vicinity here somewhere, right? So let's see. The team repeated the experiment and observed that stories boosted. Yeah, that's fine. Removing larger outlets from the analysis didn't change the effect on public conversation much. Right. Uh, right. But if the researchers had recruited large organizations, the spike may have been bigger. Okay. So made it less likely that hmm, news media outlets would be able to choose which stories to. Mhm. Okay, let's also read a little bit here. The outlets could, let's also read the design, right? 2 to 5 of these newer outlets. For example, the outlets could choose the policy area. However, the research, yeah, the outlets were free to publish whatever story they wanted outside of the experiment, right? Does that help me here? They would read more stories than they usually did. I don't think B is really relevant because there's nothing to say about what news media outlets would be able to choose, right? Mm. Hmm. Okay, let's come back to this question. I'm not sure about question 16. Let's finish the rest of it and then we can come back and see what's happening here. Okay, the passage more strongly suggests that which additional study would best have to determine more precisely the extent to which news media outlets shape public opinion in the US. And this is evidence. So let's keep the line numbers for 18, 54 to 58, 62 to 64, 70 to 73, and 73 to 77, right? So which additional study would help to determine more precisely the extent to which? Okay, so 54 to 58 says the team repeated the experiment and observed that. So this basically talks about what they already did. So I don't think this is relevant. 60, however, the researchers had recruited larger mainstream outlets. The spike may have been bigger. Right, this looks like a good option. So let's see if there is a relevant answer for this. A study that examines how influential news media outlets are to people who do not participate in. Okay, okay, right. So I don't think this is relevant, even though it seems relevant, but the options of 17 are related to social media usage. So it's not about large versus small. If the options here were large versus small, then the New York Times lines would matter. So it's not this. Let's look at 70 to 73. Though excited by the study, Economist points out that only about 20% of Americans use Twitter. So the results might not be widely applicable outside social media. Yeah, this is social media. So let's study that examines. Yeah, so A is a good answer, right? Then, okay. So 18 is C and 17 is A. Right. So why? Let's understand. Because what is his criticism? This person, Matthew Genskor's criticism is that the study is fine, but it only applies to Twitter, and Twitter is not used by the majority of Americans. So the results are not applicable outside social media. So they are not really very relevant because 80% of the news media, 80% of, rather 80% of consuming viewers, readers, etc., is outside of the purview of social media. So that is quite relevant for option uh, A, that a study which examines how influential news media outlets are to people who do not participate in social media. That would help me correct for that, right? Yeah. And we are not talking about different social media platforms, so B is not correct. Age range is not something we are discussing there, so that's not relevant. Right. And then we are not, actually, D is correct, but and that is supported by the last few lines, but that's already something uh, that is something that is already captured in the result, right? That people who are active on social media are more likely to. So that is not something that you need to conduct a study for. Okay, according to the model in figure 1, the number of Twitter posts on the relevant topics in excess of the average. Okay, so this is the one where there was a declining curve, right? The number of Twitter posts in excess of the average increased from day 1 to day 2. No. Was approximately 0 by day 3. No. Was greater than 0 for 2 weeks. It was greater than 0 throughout. Even till day 6, it was greater than 0. And decreased throughout days 1 through 6 following. So it has to be D, right? It kept decreasing. And which statement best reflects the model in figure 2? So in figure 2, we had seen that the high influencers had uh, they had a lower initial percentage change in the number of posts, but that was more consistent, right? While the low influencers started with nearly 80%, but they really dropped quickly and they were down to, they were negative actually, they were down to minus 20 almost. So what does that tell me? On day 1 following publication, the Twitter users with high influence showed a lower percentage change in their numbers. Okay, so day one, they showed a higher percentage change, right? No, they showed a lower, yeah, high influence showed lower percentage change. So A is correct actually. Option B, on day 4 following publication, Twitter users with low influence at about the same percentage change in their number as all. So day 4, okay, day 4, no, that's not correct, right? The numbers are different for all three, so B is not correct. On day 5 following publication, Twitter users with high influence posted about as frequently on the relevant topic. So posting frequently is not something that the graph measures. So C is not correct. What it measures is percentage change in the number of posts. On day 6 following publication of the experimental, all Twitter users posted again. So posting less frequently, um, actually less frequently is something which is true for day 6 of the low influencers, right? Because, but that's not something that is relevant here because we're talking about percentage change. So A is very clearly the right answer. Okay, now we have to look at 16. Twitter users would read more stories. Okay, how is there something that I think A, uh, right. So this is more stories from participating. Hmm, okay. Yeah, I think the answer is here, right? This paragraph. The team repeated the experiment 35 times and observed that story. So they basically wanted to do it 35 times, and removing larger outlets did not change the conversation. Okay, so no single organization was responsible. So Twitter users would read more stories from participating. How did they make that less likely? Uh, be able to choose tweaks. That is not less likely. Yeah, so let me use a pen here. Not B is definitely not the answer. Uh, yeah, I think C is the right answer because the thing is they repeated it for 35 weeks, right? Because if they repeated it for 35 weeks, then that means that there was like a general trend. There was a general interest from the newspapers suggested to the readers. So Twitter users would not feel that there was something unusual because it was repeated and it was. So I'll go with C for this. Okay. So let me write C here. Okay. All right, let's grade this now. So we'll start from 11 to 20. Okay, 11 is D, which is correct. Just want to look at 20. Yeah, CDBB, CDBB, CACDA, 16, CACD. Yeah, okay. So we have all the questions right this time. Okay, interesting. So if you found this video useful, please subscribe to the channel and share the video with your friends. Hit the like button. And I'll see you next time in a fresh video. Hope this was useful. Bye.